Welcome to On the Bauble podcast episode 13. I'm your host, Tsubasa J. Ueda, and with me is my co-host, Yuki Lee Bender. Today we're going to talk about the current CC meta leading up to Worlds, and we're going to review what happened at Battle Hardened Columbus and Battle Hardened Dallas Fort Worth. But before we go into that, how was your week, Yuki?
My week's been okay. Just been trying to test. I feel like my testing is going in circles. There's so many different, there's like multiple formats, and then there's a lot of decks in both those formats and different versions of those decks. So I feel like a lot of the testing is like almost coming back kind of inconclusive, but yeah, it's been okay. How's your week been, Jay?
I tried to organize the draft this weekend, and it didn't fire because a couple of people couldn't make it essentially, and then one person got sick, and it was just leading up to the draft. There was okay, we barely got 8 people together because 2 people backed out before it and whatever, but yeah, and then we just ended up not having able to do the draft, which is why we're doing a CC meta breakdown instead of a draft review that we wanted to do today. We didn't really get a draft in, so unfortunate about that. Other than that, I played on the day that I was supposed to play draft. I tried out a little bit of CC, and I think I played 2 games of Icelander, and I don't want to play Icelander anymore.
What did you play Icelander into?
I played it into Fi.
Okay.
But yeah, every time Fi played Art of War, I was just I don't have a way to make 2 Frostbites. I lose this game.
Yeah, I think the matchup can be pretty swingy, and if you chain your Channel Lake Frigids and Aether Ice Veins and Insidious Chills, then you can win pretty handily, and if they pop off when you don't have disruption for it, then you don't win those games. So yeah, definitely makes sense to me. I think the matchup's actually okay overall, but the swings are pretty big.
There was the one turn I got to keep Channel Lake Frigid up, and then that was the turn they drew 2 blues, and then they still just got to attack me.
Yeah, they're surprisingly good at playing through Channel Lake Frigid sometimes, or sometimes they'll have a blue and then a belittle, and then they get another blue, and you're like, okay, fantastic. So it can be hard for sure.
Okay, let's move on to this week's listener's question. Or we have something this time. So looks like it's one of your friend, Yuki?
Yeah, Isaac Jessen, 2021 US Nats top 8 competitor, brought Ice Lexi, and he's also on the Attack Action podcast, which is a really cool Flesh and Blood podcast for anybody who's looking for more Flesh and Blood podcasts and haven't listened to them. I'd recommend you check them out. They're one of the ones that I listen to every week. Isaac and Taylor just have pretty good takes and cover a lot of pretty I'd say they're a little more CC focused, but they cover a lot of pretty good and pretty general topics that are good for people getting into the game, I think.
Okay, let's get into the actual question. And he writes, it seems to me that people find Uprising bad because many players, even top-tier pros, have preferences and sometimes force. This leads the rest of us to force or hedge in fear of people not properly reading or following signals. If everyone at the table played completely open, without preference or insecurity, and just drafted their seat, would it be a completely healthy draft format? Wait, would it be a completely healthy draft format?
Yeah, I can start. I think that Uprising is sort of interesting. I think because of the 14 card packs, if everybody stays open too long, that can actually kind of lead to a really poor draft because nobody is sending signals. And then, or not that no one's sending signals, but nobody is clearly in a deck. And so sometimes everybody's kind of pivoting and shifting. And then you get 3 people in the same class all in a row because nobody really knows what's going on until too late. So I feel like an Uprising specifically, just because there aren't especially strong generics or especially good ways to stay open, that you kind of need some number of people sending strong signals and forcing. But I guess you also have the flip side where if everybody forces, you also can potentially wind up with real bad decks if people are forcing the same decks and they're all sitting close to each other. So I feel like you almost kind of need a mix of both, and that's kind of part of what makes Uprising draft maybe a little bit more inconsistent.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. For me, I really enjoy Uprising format now. I was originally in the camp of like I hate this format, like it sucks. But now, like now that I've played it a bunch, like I actually enjoy it again. It's like it is a really intricate puzzle of like every pick matters in this format. Like there is no bad picks. Like sorry, that's not a good way of phrasing it. Um, like every decision you make during the draft format directly affects every game you play in the uprising, like the games itself. And I think that's why I enjoy it so much. And I feel like the better drafter typically wins a lot more in uprising than in the other formats. And I think that's why I enjoy it so much, because I think I just tend to like winning more than losing. Like that's pretty obvious, but I just like winning. So like when I get to really realize my equity on just like, oh, I won this match because I made this pick, it just feels really good to me. And I like this format a lot. But I do understand why a lot of people won't like it. It feels like they either got punished really hard during their draft process and their games become very very bland or like almost unwinnable in some matches. And like the only way you can get out of that spot is to like draft another 10 times. Like if you draft 10 more times, you won't be in that spot anymore. You'll be like, oh, like 3 drafts ago, I had this game where I was like missing this specific card. I need to value that card more highly. Or like, it's like, oh, in the near the end of the game in a Dromai mirror, I had too many blues. So I should try and prioritize the red or the yellow a little bit more. Things like that really adds up, and I think makes this draft format very interesting and very skill testing. And I'm pretty excited at Worlds because everyone's gonna be good, and I want to see if I can actually beat everyone else at Worlds too.
Yeah, drafting at a high level is always really exciting. And I think I agree with you about this format being quite skill testing and feeling like all of your decisions matter. And I think that it is probably the most punishing format that we have so far. If you hesitate and waffle a little bit too long or take too long identifying the what deck you want to be drafting or should be drafting, you just won't make playables, and it can be pretty brutal. I do agree though that I think that through some combination of balancing like staying open a little bit and but also trying to send signals, you can usually kind of either wind up in the open lane just by happenstance or find a chance to pivot into the open lane pretty early before it's too late to do so. So I think there's lots of opportunities to do that. I just think that the window and time frame to do so is very small, and you have to be very aware of what picks you have, what picks you've sent, and what those signals are, and kind of like what options are still available to you. Because I feel like in this format, especially, sometimes if you just pass like one card, then the door to that hero is like almost shut to you because you're probably putting your neighbor into it, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think in this format, like pick three, pack one, pick three, pack one, pick four, and like if you're still, I think that those two picks right there, pack one, pick three, pack one, pick four is the most important picks in this format. And once you get past that point, you're going to be in a lot of trouble if you haven't really figured out your table at that point. And sometimes you can, and sometimes that might just kill you in the whole draft. Like you won't be able to go 3-0 anymore. And that could be pretty frustrating, honestly, where you just didn't really have a control over it, or like, Dromai was open for the first 4 packs, and then like because that was the case, like 3 people moved into it or something. Like that happens a bunch in this format too, where like people recognize that it's might be open, and then they all move in at the same time at pack one, pick four, and then they all cut each other. So it's a tricky format. It's interesting. Like sometimes you even really got to play the players and recognize someone really likes fire or someone really likes Icelander, and some people is not going to be willing to move out of the hero they choose no matter what, even if their deck becomes worse.
Yeah, I think if you have knowledge on what people like to draft, you should definitely be trying to leverage that knowledge and think about what might be a good hero to draft given your position relative to them. Sometimes if they're on the opposite side of the table, it's a little bit harder. But if you're passing to them or receiving from them, that can be quite useful to know for sure. Even if they're like only like 2 seats away or something, pretty helpful.
Okay, let's just move on to our main topic. Our main topic, we're gonna be talking about the Battle Hardened that just happened, which is Battle Hardened Columbus, right?
I wonder if we should talk about Dallas Fort Worth first as some kind of like a bit of background, and then we can go to Columbus, which is the most recent results.
Okay, sounds good. Then we'll first talk about Dallas Fort Worth. So this is the first Battle Hardened that happened after the banning of Pulse of Eisenloft. And you want to just go into the topic, Yuki?
Yeah, so the top 8 of this Battle Hardened was 2 Phys, 3 Briars, 1 Oldham, 1 Dorenthia, and 1 Lexi. Notably, this is immediately after US Nationals. I think it's the following week. So I think a lot of people are tired from their nationals testing. And then there was also the ban announcement on the Monday following that weekend with US nationals. And I know there were other nationals as well. I believe New Zealand was that weekend. And I think there were some other big ones. But yeah, it's sort of like in a lot of ways like a little bit of a shakeup. And people are not necessarily like the decks I don't think are necessarily super refined or adapted to the new meta yet, given I think a lot of people are like kind of burnt out, but it is our first look at a new format. And ultimately, Peter ended up bringing down the event on Phi, and it was a list kind of like what we saw at US Nationals that is moving towards having a greater number of 3 blocks and running cards like Enlightened Strike rather than just all the 3 for 0 block twos. And this kind of gives it the ability to block and play 2 card hands instead of just like always trying to be foot on the gas. And the idea is to have a little bit better of an Oldham matchup. So it's kind of, we see a little bit of this in US Nationals, but I feel like this event, for me at least, really kind of solidifies Phi's place in the meta as a potential major player going into Worlds.
Yeah, the most represented deck also is Briar, and if we categorize these the 5 heroes that top 8 at Dallas, it's gonna be 5 Briar as the aggro decks, Oldham as the control deck, and Dorenthia and Lexi as more of like a mid range interactive deck. Uh, and 5 of the 8 is aggro. There's 2 Phis and 3 Briars. And this is typical in like every TCG. Right after bannings, the aggro decks typically tend to move up, and then later in the format, these mid range and control players um, assess that these are the aggro decks to beat, and then they form their decks to be able to beat these aggro decks. So if you were trying to win Dallas, I think the best deck to bring was one of the aggro decks, so either Fi or Briar, and it ended up winning. But it's actually pretty interesting. I want to talk about the mid range decks here. The one Dorenthia deck and one Lexi deck. Let's pull up one of their deck lists here, actually. Which one do you want to talk about first, Yuki?
Yeah, we can take a look at the Lexi deck first. So Matt Garner on Lexi, fairly standard equipment loadout with bullseye bracers, tunic, New Horizon, Nullrune boots, perch grappler, snaps, and Voltaire. So very, very standard. And it looks like it's doing a lot of kind of classic Ice Lexi things, running like the 6 Bolton shots, red and yellow, running red and yellow, chilling Ice Vein. Notably, we don't see any Blizzard bolts, which is quite interesting in red or yellow pitch. That's typically been a staple. And instead, we see a little bit more in the case of generics like Endless Arrows, Fatigue Shot, Headshot, Pathing Helix, Remorseless, Searing Shot, Sleep Dart. So, really not leaning quite as hard into the ice package, although it does have some of the premium ice blues and Channel Lake Frigid as well. Actually, there is no Channel Lake Frigid. I wonder if that's accurate.
Yeah, sometimes Fab TCG's deck lists are slightly off. Like it's like a typo, or like maybe like whoever is putting it in onto the website makes like a spelling error, or maybe it's a code error or something like that that displays a wrong card. So we don't actually. This is like we're just pulling these lists off of Fab TCG. So if it's not 100% correct, that may be the case.
Yeah. It could be the case that they've omitted channel here. I think looking a little bit more closely, well, it is surprising. They do have 12 ice blues, but maybe they felt like with 12 it's not quite enough to support channel. I think that's right. You usually need about 14 to really support channel is sort of the number that I like. So even though it does have more ice reds, like Ice Quake and Arctic Incarceration, those don't really help. You don't want to pitch those to play channel like Frigid. So I think maybe there's a conscious choice here to move away from Blizzard Bolt and channel like Frigid and just have like some red ice cards that are disruptive on their own, and then just like a few of the ice blues, because ice blues are pretty good, and then you can still run the chilling ice veins, and you won't fuse them all the time, but you don't have to fuse them all the time. There's fusing it half the time is plenty good enough. So pretty interesting list.
What I've just noticed though is Arctic Incarceration is pretty sick with Lexi, isn't it? Because you arsenal this card, you flip it up, it gives them Frostbite, then you play it, so it gives them 4 Frostbites on this card?
Yeah, notably the card doesn't have go again, but there are some pretty powerful play patterns with it. A common one is to go arrow with go again with an arrow face up in arsenal, and then if they no block you, just slam Arctic Incarceration from hand, and kind of punish them for not blocking and thinking they're going to have a turn with no disruption. It especially works well with generic arrows that aren't forcing on hits, like this list plays a lot of, so that makes sense there. The other play pattern is you can flip it up and leave it in arsenal, and you kind of put them in a spot where if they don't block, you can play Arctic, but if they do block, you can hold on to it. So there's like a little bit of a mind game there. Although when this is in your arsenal, it is quite hard to push damage because you're limited to the 2 arrows, and that's usually like 5 and 5. So most decks can block that out. So it's interesting.
Fair enough, fair enough. Well, let's move on to the next deck I just want to talk about quickly will be Dorenthia. This is actually, like, when Dorenthia was popular was actually a little bit before my time, so I'm not too familiar with how Dorenthia plays or like what's interesting about this deck list. Do you know anything, Yuki?
Yeah, so I think this Dorenthia deck list is really looking to prey on the aggro decks and leverage Glistening Steel Blade, which is a new card from Reinhardt versus Dorenthia that's kind of made Dorenthia have like a little bit of comeback. She hasn't been like, I wouldn't say that she's been meta, but she's been sort of fringe playable since she got that card. And it's just really, really good because it like since it gives the Dawnblade counter on any Dawnblade hit, it forces your opponent to block. And when you're playing against aggro decks, forcing them to block is really good. Technically, they can ignore it and let you get the counters, but if you hit twice with your Dawnblade because they don't do any blocking, that's 2 counters from Steelblade and then 1 counter from Dawnblade itself. And when your Dawnblade goes from doing 3 damage to 6 damage for the rest of the game, it gets pretty out of hand and it's pretty hard to race. So I think this deck is really here as a meta call to deal with the Fi decks, and we even see some nods to like Fi with This Round's on Me as one of their blues. Pretty good card on turn 0. You can just play it out, attack them, force cards out of their hand so they don't get the extra card, and then they start their turn with -1 on all their attacks. And it's also just a blue 3 block.
Interesting. Is there any card that like stands out other than This Round's on Me?
Yeah, there's also some attack actions in this list. I know that Dorenthias have been playing around with different number of attack actions. The idea here is that because you have access to some unconditional go again through cards like Glint the Quicksilver, Glistening Steel Blade is also unconditional, and there's a few others in the deck. Having the attack action can kind of prevent your opponent from just playing the line where, okay, you have a go again, I'm just going to throw my whole hand so it can't hit and you don't get the extra swing. You now get to punish that not only with Twinning Blade, which gives you an extra swing to get around that like all block on the first attack, but also running a couple of attacks, in particular Enlightened Strike, just kind of classic, very good threat, and Coax a Commotion, which I'm assuming is here just because it costs 0, and then on hit you can get the Quicken token, which is very good for Dorenthia, and probably a little bit less good in your average deck, relatively speaking. So I think that's the idea behind the attacks. But yeah, otherwise looks like mostly fairly standard list. Has a few D reacts probably to deal with Oldhim, but yeah, I think makes a lot of sense, and I could potentially see Dorenthia doing well if aggro really shows up in force at Worlds, although I think your matchup into both ice heroes, I say both. Oldhim and Icelander, the popular ice heroes, can be quite rough. So
Yeah, it seems fair. Okay. Do you wanna move on to Columbus, or do you want to talk about the Oldham list?
I think we should maybe talk about the Phi deck. This Oldham list is quite an early version, and I think Michael Fang has since switched lists. Unfortunately, at this time of recording, we actually don't have the Columbus deck lists. But I think just giving a little bit of a backdrop with the Phi deck, because we see a bit of a spoiler, we do see a very similar style of Phi deck show up in force at Columbus. I don't necessarily know the list that won, but it did look like it was playing a lot of the similar cards, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's just an evolution of that deck. That was kind of my impression from watching it.
Okay, then whose deck list do you want to go into? Do you want to go into Peters, who won?
Yeah, we might as well. So Peter had an interesting take. A lot of the standard equipment, flame scale furnace, mask of momentum, pouncing links, and this is a searing emberblade deck, which is definitely the way Phis have been going. You have access to arcane barrier through tide flippers and null rune, and you also have your usual setup, which is snapdragon scalers, tiger stripe shuko, mask of the pouncing links, and then one of the chess pieces, either Tunic for a long game, Flame Scale Furnace if you need a block, or Blossom of Spring if you want to be explosive. I believe Peter has a deck tech on this deck, so if you are interested, you can check it out. I think in the deck tech he mentioned that he felt like Mask of Momentum was primarily for Dromai, but and just like he just favored the raw damage off links instead, because it's pretty easily a 6. Like you grab a lava burst, you probably played a Phoenix Flame, so that's probably 6 off of what is it, Shuko, and then if you have an Art of War, it would be a 7. So pretty easy to get this card to pouncing links to just represent 7 damage, and if you have 40 life, that's like
Almost a quarter, just
yeah,
under a quarter, or just under a quarter, 20%.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so what we see in this deck is, I guess I can just go through it. There's at red, there's 3 Belittle, 3 Brown with Cinder Claw, 3 Double Strike, 3 E Strike, 3 Flame Call Awakening, 3 Lava Burst, 3 Lava Vein Loyalty, 3 Mounting Anger, 2 Phoenix Flame, 3 Rise from the Ashes, 3 Rising Resentment, 3 Ronin Renegade, 3 Sinks, 3 Snatch, 2 Soaring, 3 Spreading Flames. At yellow, there's just 3 Art of Wars and one of Salt the Wounds as a tutor target for pouncing links. And then in blues, there's the 3 Brown with Cinder Claws, 3 Energy Potions, 3 Lava Vein Loyalties, 1 Minnowism, 3 Rising Resentments, and 2 Snatch. So this list has access to a total of 15 blues. I imagine the Energy Potions are mostly sideboard into the ice stacks, kind of as a way to hedge around like Blizzard and things like that. And then you also have belittles, which sort of function as pseudo blues as well. So if you count the belittles, it's almost like 18 blues. So this deck is kind of built with ice in mind. And what you'll see is some unusual card choices, like Enlightened Strike, and more of the 4 breakpoints. Like Mounting Anger is pretty common, but they're also playing cards like Soaring Strike and Snatch that hit that 4 breakpoint that make it really kind of just be a nuisance to block out and build up the big Salt the Wound counter over time.
Oh, that's actually pretty cool. I didn't notice this when I first looked at this list. There's no red Minnowism.
Yeah, so it's just running the 1 blue, and it's purely using belittles as like a -2 resource for 3 go again kind of deal.
Yeah, that's pretty strong.
Yeah, and I think the idea behind the Blossom of Spring is that you can, whenever you're ready, whenever your hand dictates it, you can either Blossom of Spring for a belittle and then get a blue Minnowism, so you don't have to pitch a card to play the belittle, or you can Blossom for an Art of War. So those are some really strong things to do. I know another line this deck likes to do is it will like belittle, get a Minnowism, play a Flame Call Awakening, search for a Phoenix Flame, and then banish the Phoenix Flame with Art of War to get big value off of it. So that's why the second Flame is there, is mostly as a tutor target for the Flame Call Awakening, and it just has amazing synergy with Art of War. So that's kind of what this deck is trying to do. And it's trying to just have like one big burst turn with the Blossom of Spring and Pouncing Lynx, which we were seeing a little bit in CC for a while. But the difference is this deck's no longer like just killing you outright or forcing you to block right away. It's just getting you kind of low and then slowly chipping you out with the 4 power attacks.
Man, this deck looks good. Like, maybe I play this for Worlds.
Yeah, it's definitely really solid. There's also some cute synergy, like the 2 soaring strikes can enable a snatch with go again. If you let them hit, you can just banish the snatch, and then the snatch has go again. So quite an interesting deck. And again, a bit of a spoiler. I think we see something fairly similar to this show up in Columbus in Force, and in particular, a lot of the kind of additions of Enlightened Strike, more focus on Pouncing Lynx, playing Belittles, having some of the like soaring strikes and snatches. That's all become quite standard. And yeah, we've kind of slowly seen this idea develop, and we really kind of see it come to a head in Columbus, which maybe we can just move on to talk about.
Yeah, that's a good segue. So the Columbus breakdown was actually pretty interesting. Okay, so the most represented deck in Battle Hardened Columbus was Phi. Phi had 18.32% of the meta share, followed by Icelander with 21 showings at 16%, and Oldhim at 15 showings at 11%. Everyone else is actually less than 10% of the meta. Notably, Bravo, which is there was 10 at 7.63%. And then almost all the other heroes was like pretty spread out. There's like 8 Dory, 8 Dromai, 8 Lexi, 8 Viscerai. And similarly, there's 7 Briar and 7 Reinhards as well.
Yeah, so we do get a pretty diverse metagame here. There is a smattering of other decks, like we see a little bit of Bolton, there's 1 Kano, 3 Azalea, 4 Levia. So we do see most things show up for Dash as well, but it really is kind of concentrated on Phi, Icelander, Oldhim, and then some of the other, like the usual suspects and a lot of the aggro decks like Briar and so on. So I think this is probably the best snapshot that we're going to get going into Worlds. And I do think that even though Phi, Icelander, and Oldhim might be like the biggest decks that people are talking about and testing for, I think that you should be expecting to see a pretty diverse field, and you should have plans into a lot of these decks, especially the ones that are kind of like hovering around that 8 players or 6% mark. I think we're going to see some of those come to Worlds as well.
Mm-hmm. It's actually going to be more interesting because, like, I feel like for Worlds, there's going to be less Levia players, there's going to be less Lexi players. All of like the 5% decks, they're going to show up even less, and a lot of the more higher percentage decks is going to show up even in like a bigger quantity.
Mhm.
So top 8 in Worlds might not be that diverse, just because like the top 8 in that event is it's just such a high value that I don't think people is gonna be lofting around.
Yeah, I'll be surprised. I don't know. I think that there's some. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some spicy decks come out, some people having some interesting tech, or even some people really trying to attack some of the big decks. I think Worlds being split format is kind of interesting. There's only the 5 rounds of CC and Swiss, and then five Blitz and 6 draft. So your CC deck is important, but I could see that if somebody's like really wanting to just spike the event, I could see maybe targeting what they think is the winner's metagame. Although I'll let you know from my testing, I've been having a hard time nailing that down exactly what that looks like. I think it's something kind of like Columbus, but there is quite a few decks in there, so targeting it can be a little challenging. Although I do think if somebody's successful in finding something that kind of handles the ice decks and the aggro decks, they could be in a really good spot.
Okay, let's move on to the decks. So before that, there were 5 players at X and one going into top 8. Okay, so there were 5 decks X and one that made the top 8, and there were 3 X2s that bubbled in essentially. And sorry, how many X2s did you say there was, Yuki?
There was quite a few. I think it went all the way down to like 16th or 18th or so. So there was a bit of a drama in this top eight cut, just in terms of just like a lot of people on the bubble who didn't quite make it. And I know, for example, that I think Michael Hamilton was on the bubble there with Icelander. So keep in mind that some of these X2 decks that sneak in could easily be another deck if things just broke a little bit differently.
Okay, so at X and one, there were 5 decks. There were 2 Oldhams, 1 one Briar, and 1 Viscerai. The 3 decks that made it in at X and two is 1 1 Dromai, and drumroll please, 1 Azalea. That's a pretty sick one that made it in.
So our overall meta breakdown is 2 2 Oldham, 1 Dromai, 1 Azalea, 1 Briar, and 1 Viscerai for the top eight. And it's interesting because compared to Battle Hardened Dallas, we see Oldham starting to show up in force. I think that this might be, despite having the third most represented meta share, like down at 11%, beneath quite a bit beneath Phi at 18%, and also quite a bit beneath Icelander at 16%. We see Oldham showing up and really performing. And I think this might be partially due to what Jay said about, the control decks adapting to aggro decks, and also partially that Oldham was the one hero hit by a ban. So I think he has a little bit more to figure out than the other decks, which could kind of just play the same deck and see how it goes. And then eventually you'll have to adapt, of course, because the meta will shift. But on like week one, just playing the same old deck is a pretty good strategy. Whereas in Oldham, I think that's less of an option.
Yeah, the one deck that I want to say is congratulations on Azalea. It's been a while since Azalea like made any kind of appearance in a top 8.
Yeah, and I believe that this was Levi on Azalea, and I know that Levi puts quite a bit of content out on YouTube, and is quite well known as an Icelander player and somebody who kind of like pioneered Icelander in the early days. I know there was a number of people working on that deck list, so it wasn't just Levi by any means, but definitely like a popular voice working on that deck. So interesting to see him move away from Icelander and choose to actually bring Azalea to this event. My best guess here is really wanting to target the aggro matchups, which did show up. There was 2-5, 1 Briar, 1 Viscerai in top 8. And if you look at kind of like the overall breakdown, let's see, we have 18-5, 5 Briars, so that's 23%. Viscerai is another 6%, so 29%. So that's almost a third of the field is these kind of like 3 aggro decks. If you expect them to do well, maybe targeting them is a reasonable way to go, especially if you're okay with your like your Icelander matchup and maybe even your Oldham matchup. We did see him give some Oldhams a run for their money on stream.
What else do you want to talk about Columbus? Because we just don't have deck lists yet.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't really have deck lists right now, so I think this is as much as we can get into Battle Hardened Columbus.
I feel like there's got to be more we can say. Did we say who was in the finals? I don't know if we actually said it was Drove versus Phi in finals. Phi wins. So ultimately, at Battle Hardened Columbus, we do see a Drove versus Phi finals with Phi coming out on top, which I think is to be expected in that matchup. It can be quite hard for Dromai, although I believe Dromai did beat the Phi in Swiss, is what I heard. So perhaps there's some legs in that matchup, but I do think it's traditionally quite a tough matchup for Dromai, and she's probably really looking to prey more on the ice heroes. So I guess the notable trends that we see here is in both battle hardens, we actually see a total absence of Icelander in top 8, despite being very well represented in Columbus at 16%. You would really expect to see an Icelander in there, and yes, there were some that bubbled, so don't read too much into it, but it was an 8-round event, so a little bit of a surprise there. Phi doing about as expected, putting in 2 copies at 18% is pretty reasonable. And then I think Oldham being a bit of an overperformer here with 2 copies in at only 11%, definitely doing, conversion rate wise, that's like almost, twice as many in top 8 as in the total population. So strong showing from Oldham, and then interesting showing here from Azalea too. There was only 3 players on Azalea, but small sample size, best not to read too much into it. But I think there is room to perhaps attack these aggro decks going into Worlds.
Does this mean you're gonna start testing Azalea a little bit and seeing what it's about?
Ooh, I'm going to be honest, I hadn't really considered it. It's been a long time since I played Azalea, and I don't know that I have that much time to test for Worlds left. I have report cards due 3 days after Worlds, so there's just not that much time for me to test, unfortunately. As of right now, I'm kind of trying to decide. I think between Oldhim and Icelander. I don't really want to play an aggro deck, although I recognize that Fi is very, very good. And maybe I think you could make a strong case that Fi could be the deck to bring. I think I'd rather bring Oldhim or Icelander, although it's interesting. I've been feeling worse and worse about Icelander lately, and the results of these events also seem to support that. Granted, they're only battle hardens, and I think we might see some Icelander do well at Worlds, but yeah, Icelander, there's definitely a few question marks there. I'd be really curious how many of these Icelanders were like a spell based one versus an attack based one, because I think that those are, well, there's some similarities. They really are separate decks. So we're not quite getting the full picture here. And it could be that maybe one variant is more successful than the other, and that's not showing up in the data.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, let's just move on to some Worlds predictions. What do you think is going to be the most represented deck at Worlds in the CC portion?
I suspect it's going to be Fi. The deck's just really powerful, has a strong proactive plan into a lot of decks. It's quite resilient. And I've heard from a lot of people that there's just sort of like, I think it's a busy time of year. It sounds like quite a few people are a little bit strapped on time for testing. So I think we're going to see Fi really show up. And I think that honestly, I'm expecting a little bit more Briar than what showed up here. Briar's been consistently doing well. It did well in national season. There was 3 copies in Dallas Fort Worth and 1 copy here. And don't forget, Briar basically took over Pro Tour Lille. So I'm really expecting Briar to have a bigger share and a bigger showing than it has. And I think that, for example, like I know Hong Kong really likes, and the APAC region really seems to like their Briar. We saw that at the Calling Singapore. So I think that some Briars are going to come out of the woodwork. So I'm expecting a lot of Fi and Briar, and then, a smattering of ice decks.
Now, hot take. What do you think is going to win Worlds? So, Worlds is only 5 rounds of CC, but top 8 is played as CC. So, what do you think is going to win? Just a deck, a hero.
Honestly, I think it might be Oldhim. I think that, yeah, I think that people are kind of low on Oldhim right now. I think the deck, my gut feeling is that Oldhim is strong, and if you can really dial in your aggro matchups as well as your Icelander matchup, then I think that Oldhim could be in a really good place. So I think if somebody's able to really tune that list, and there are some very good Oldhim players out there, I wouldn't be surprised to see Oldhim take the whole event to down. But, there's a lot of good options that could make it as well.
Nah, that seems fair.
What about you, Jay? What's your prediction?
Oh, you know what? I think it's going to be Fi. And the only reason, I'm pretty sure I'm going to bring Fi now to Worlds. I'm going to win this event. I always go in thinking I'm going to win. I'm going to win every single round.
How accurate has that been in your career in Fab so far?
In Fab? Oh, I think every single event I said I'll take down, I have. One I said as a joke at the Pro Quest against you, and then it actually happened. And like my nationals, like this Canadian nationals, I said I'm gonna top 8. I top 8'd, and then immediately dropped.
It's true. You did.
But at the same time, I did say I would never lose the mirror, and I did. So I don't know. People are good.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. People are getting better and better at Fab all the time, and the game is quite challenging. But yeah, you heard it here first. Jay to win Worlds. Hopefully, our episode after Worlds will be congratulating Jay on his sweet, sweet victory. But we'll see. I'm sure we'll have a good episode regardless.
yeah. That's his dream right now. That was great. Okay. Let's. Actually, I think that's everything we want to talk about this episode.
Yeah. So as always, thank you for listening. If you have questions that you want answered on the show or you want to get in touch with us, please just comment on our most recent YouTube video. You can also tweet at me at Bender on Twitter, or you can email us at onthebauble@gmail.com. We really do like to get those listener questions in and kind of spark some interesting discussion for us. Oh no.
Hmm?
I just like blanked after that.
Okay, well, we can end it here and move on to sign offs. So, for the sign offs today, you want to do like a mini preview of the preview card we got?
Sure.
How much
So,
how much can we talk about it? We definitely can't talk about the text on the card.
yeah, I don't think we can say too much about the card, but well, I'm trying to think of what people have done in the past. Have people told people what class it is?
Yeah, we know Sparka Genius has a mech card.
Okay. I guess we can say that I won't say it, but
Right.
you can probably guess what class it is.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say too. It's Yuki. It's definitely. I like literally when I said when she told me she's gonna get a spoiler card, I was assuming it was gonna be for this class. It's not a generic card. It's for a specific class, and yeah, that's very fitting.
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting spoiler card. I do think that it will see play in at least one deck. I do not know how good that deck will be overall, but I do think it's a very powerful card, and it's gotten me, I don't know about you, Jay, but it's gotten me very curious about what the rest of Uprising is going to have because yeah, it just seems like a very cool design space, and I'm really curious to see like what all they do with the kind of mechanics that they have showing that they're showing off here.
Yeah, I agree, but when Yuki messaged me first about the preview card like a day ago or something like that, because we're gonna right after this episode we're going to end up filming the video to release next week on November 1st. That's when our spoiler card goes live. But just looking at this card and like reading it, it's just like, wow, like this card is good. Like this card is definitely good. What Yuki's saying is like it has a very unique mechanic on it, and she's saying this mechanic has to be supported. I don't think this mechanic has to be supported for this card to be good. This card on its own, I think, is great, but
Yeah,
we'll have to see.
definitely. We'll have to see what the rest of the spoiler season brings us and what all of you think about the card when you finally get to see it.
Okay, I think that's about it. Please check our spoiler video out next week. I think next week's episode we're just gonna be talking about spoilers, right?
Yeah. Next week's episode, we probably won't have the complete spoiler list first. We usually record on the Monday, which should be November 1st, actually, our spoiler date. So we'll have most of the spoilers at that point, I believe. I think that's the last day for the spoiler season, but there's probably a few that we'll be missing. But I mean, that's okay. We're not going to cover every card anyways, and we can cover most of them. And if there's anything really big that we missed, we can talk about it on our Worlds episode.
Yeah, and don't worry, I'm definitely gonna be talking about the Rock.
Yeah,
I'm in
Jay is a
love.
big rock fan.
That card. That card is exactly what I want to play with. Block for 12, block for 12. Find a way to attack for 7. Oh, wow. Looks so good. Okay. Well, good night, guys.
Thanks for listening.